Hello, I am Lenore Sheffman, and I am here with Alexis Clements, the filmmaker for this wonderful film we've just watched. And Alexis, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
We're excited to have you. It was such a great film. We just met before coming on for this Q&A, and I'm really excited to kind of dig into this and talk about your experience. You filmed this clearly before the pandemic. Nobody's wearing a mask, so that's evident.
Yeah, there's lots of people, indoor spaces together. Yeah, right.
Well, so what's so interesting to me about that is now we've come full circle. You're talking about loss of community. You're highlighting all the losses of queer space, and what are we seeing now? Are you following that for post-pandemic? Is there an extra charge to the loss?
Yeah, well, one of the things, it's interesting, one of the things that motivated me to make this film, there were many motivations. You learn that when you engage in a multi-year project, but one of the motivations is that around the time I was starting to make this film, the stories of bars closing felt relentless. It was a few years after, the earliest planning for this started in about 2013, late 2013. I just started to form the idea, and then we hit the road in 2014 in the summer. And for a couple of years leading up to that, which was a couple of years after the 2008 pandemic, we were just seeing, or not the pandemic, sorry, getting my economic disasters mixed up, the recession. We were seeing a lot of closures, and in particular about lesbian bars, although that has expanded beyond those communities these days. And I was so burnt out on that narrative of loss, and I was participating in spaces that were not closed. So I was really curious why, it's so important to mark losses and talk about the inequalities and the reasons why those things happen. But I was really curious, why are some of these spaces able to stick around, and what strategies have they employed to be able to be resilient when we are seeing so many other losses, with the hope that some of the lessons learned in there could be offered to other people. That having been said, I also, in the process of making this film, really came to resist the notion that loss is the same as failure, right? Because I think that we, especially, I would say especially queer women and trans folks, there's this narrative, like, because of the inequality that exists, because of the lack of resources in so many of these communities, and also communities of color, I should add to that. There's just this like, oh, we can never get enough, you kind of failed, and then you add things like misogyny and trans misogyny, and it just becomes this soup of despair and failure. And it's okay, actually, right? Like, one of the people in the film says it, Deb, who's one of the founders of the Lesbian History Archive, some places run their course. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, Like, if you were gonna look just at bars, straight bars close all the time. Bars are incredibly difficult business. And so the fact that it had a few years and then it closed doesn't necessarily mean it's a failure. It provided amazing things while it was there, and we should celebrate that too. So I'm kind of like exploring a few things in response to your question. I do think that we're gonna see an enormous number of losses after this. I think it's impossible for that not to happen. But I do think that in the kinds of reevaluation that are happening in this time, because it's not just the health crisis, it's the economic crisis, and also the crisis that is white supremacy, and how that is also being brought to a head in this moment. There's so much reevaluation happening in this moment. And we see that all these rules and ways of being that we thought were intractable before are actually changeable. And so, not to be Pollyanna-ish about it, but I do think there's some interesting reevaluation, let's say, that's happening right now that could offer new models and possibilities for the future.
Let's pick that up there, because I threw out this huge softball for you in the beginning. Okay. You know, you talk about resilience of our community, and of course that is a hallmark and a pillars of who we are. And it also, you know, one of the galvanizing things for any
Mm-hmm.
minority community is the fact that we come together when tough times occur.
Mm-hmm.
Staying with your topic of loss versus failure, which I think is a really important note, what I definitely would like to see as we rebuild and recreate community space, assuming we do that, because that's a whole nother set of questions I have for you. Um,
Yeah.
that maybe this time, you know, we will build racial equity into our communities because it's A, so important, B, so
Mm-hmm.
negated, and it doesn't,
Right.
nobody wants it that way, you know.
Right.
We're a collective community, and to me that will be a big win. Yeah, yeah. So let's talk about a little bit the identity issue here that you address when the film starts out, right? We're looking at how we seek community in these spaces. And to me, it wasn't specifically spoken about, but this is also where we form our identities. You know, we come out, we start looking. I loved where you're like, where are the queer people? Where are the lesbians? I remember coming out in the 80s and I joined the Coast Guard looking for the gay people. I was like, where are my people? That was a terrible mistake, by the way. I mean, I like what a hard way to go find gay people, right? Go hard. But what are we seeing, you know, now? You're following this continuum. Where is it that young queers are coming and finding community when these spaces have all, you know, sloughed off in a sense?
Well, I think what's exciting to see is that the same models that were always there are still available. You know, they might be tweaked around the edges, but for instance, one of the groups that's featured in the film is the Trans Ladies Picnics,
Oh,
and amazing group. I love the like radical anarchist politic with which they like Red formed that group. It has a very clear politic around it, and the refusal to be owned, the refusal to be co-opted, the refusal to be a service-oriented group of any form. But one of the things that's really moving to me about that chapter in the film is thinking about the ways in which they are doing similar work to what people were doing, you know, what lesbian feminists were doing in the 70s and trans activists were doing in the 70s, right? We had like the transsexual menace came later, but there were trans folks doing organizing back then. But you just see this constant sort of circulation of the same models with a little tweak, and maybe who's participating. But one thing that I come to a lot is like, for me, when I think in particular of spaces and politics that centered female identified people or people who are on the femme spectrum, I think of this legacy from the 70s of people self-inventing, right? Of people saying, I don't like the boundaries you're putting me in. That doesn't suit me, that doesn't. And so I think what's exciting that you see today is the continuation of that self-invention, right? Like lesbian feminists in the 70s were like, I can be a dyke, I can be a woman, I can have a mustache, I can have a beard, I can wear clothes that you don't like, I can fuck who I like, I can do whatever I like, and I'm gonna define myself as a woman. And we see that same thing continuing to happen. And I like thinking about it as an expansion of self-invention, because I think so often people get caught up in this scarcity mentality or this idea that reinvention or new labels are at odds with the old labels. And I see it as quite the opposite. I see it as an extension of the work that like the folks who were really at the frontiers of queer liberation have been doing, you know, decades ago. And that's just extending into the future.
and as a continuum to that, I just want to give a shout out to our community partner sponsor for this event for your film, All We've Got. We have Bookwoman here in Austin, and it is
Yeah,
owned
I saw that.
by Susan Post and Dana Marcus Wolf. And I mean, they're legacies of the city. They've been part of the activism and, you know, the intellect for sure. But they've also survived. And I think part of what you're talking about, not
Mhm.
just resiliency, but those old cornerstones of what made our grassroots politic work are at play in
Mhm.
Susan's mind. And it's definitely, wow, tenacity. She's got the brains and the grit, you know. It's
Mhm.
radically awesome. But you know, you also the bearded lady. Oh, you just brought to mind with the bearded or anything. So we lost that a long time ago in San Francisco, but that was a wonderful little place as well.
Yep. Yep.
Um, so you know, talk about that. Talk about the disappearing bookstore space. It's always
Right.
been this archival piece. It's been a community piece. It's been so
Right.
much, you know.
I mean, the challenges that a bookstore faces are in some ways related to the challenge that a bar faces versus a place like the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center or the Lesbian History Archives, because they are engaged in commerce.
Right.
And it's just, you know, they have a bigger challenge than a bar because we know that the way that money circulates around bars, that there's like a higher markup, basically. Like you can make a little bit more profit at a bar than you can make. I'm not saying a lot, because we all know that especially, you know, women focused and trans focused and mixed spaces really struggle. But it's that mix of capitalism and politics, and it's a struggle. You know, you see the bookstores. I actually went to a bookstore for the film. I went to a bunch of places that are not in the film, and I'm very sorry to say that that bookstore is no longer with us. It was
Was
a
that in other words?
bookstore. What's that?
Was that in other words?
No, it was not In Other Words, which has, I mean, you see In Other Words at the opening of the film. No, it was a bookstore in Gainesville, Florida. And for some reason, I'm blanking on the name because I think I'm on camera. I'm blanking on the name. But it was a bookstore in Gainesville, Florida, that had been founded by a couple back in the 70s and had changed ownership at various times. And they were doing what a lot of queer and feminist bookstores and radical bookstores are doing. They were trying to shift to a nonprofit model. And I see that over and again. You know, In Other Words actually tried that as well. You see this in a bunch of bookstores, but I think because people think of a bookstore as a place to purchase things, then additionally asking for money just creates this mixed model that is very complicated for people. But I do think some of the bookstores that don't have quite enough turnover of product have to have some sort of mixed revenue model, because it is just a pure brute reality of like, can I pay the rent?
Sure.
And you know, if you don't own the building or have some control over the largest bill that you have to pay other than your staff, then it's really a struggle, that mix of commerce and community.
That's super fair. You know, we were talking too about there are so many shared and mixed use spaces now for offices and for folks. And I am wondering if you see some path to using places where, you know, they are branded as like women workspaces, or
Mm-hmm.
like, can we see, is this going to be our new future for live community space, or are we really looking at a future of Zoom? Like what, if you had
Yeah,
a ball based
no,
on your,
I think that this question of, yeah, like virtual community versus in-person community, for me, I very intentionally focused on in-person community. You know, we've had virtual community in queer communities since, you know, I know a couple who met in an AOL chat room,
was
right?
saying,
AOL was really important to a lot of queers.
that's a
Um,
grinder.
So, and we've had, you know, these dating apps. So like we've actually had virtual community access for years in the queer community. It's not new. I think it's an amazing supplement. And for some people, especially people with accessibility issues or social, you know, anxieties, online spaces can be incredibly productive and a point of connection. But the thing that I really like to think about when I'm thinking about any kind of community, and really I'll say, because one of one of the other motivations for me in making this film was really to try to understand what community is. We talk about that word so much. We use that word so much in our culture, and it's particularly used in a lot of ways to try to homogenize marginalized communities. You know, everybody's like, oh, the LGBT community, singular, as if there is such a thing. There's no such thing. We know that. We're not the same people. We don't think the same ways, blah, blah, blah. I don't have to say that. But so when I was really looking at how to define community for myself as I was making this film, what became clear is that for me, it's smaller groups of people engaged in a shared project or a shared goal. And the reason that I think of it that way, that's my frame for thinking about it, is because that builds in accountability. For me, I didn't have a lot of experience of community. As a kid, I was a military brat. I moved around. I changed schools a lot. Community was very theoretical, but not like a lived thing. And for me, what community has provided for me is forced me to deal with myself and other people in ways that I normally would have just walked away from. I would have been like, I'm uncomfortable. I don't like what's happening here. I'm out. But I was so invested in the shared project or the shared goal that I actually had to stick around, right? And I had to deal with people who were different than me or who thought differently. So that opens up some really interesting things for me when thinking about like virtual versus in person. There are things that happen in person that can't happen in virtual. And so much of what we do, the work we do in life, especially if we want to think of ourselves as engaged in political work or social justice work, so much of that work is that everyday contact and those moments of discomfort. And virtual space is really bad at conflict, right? Virtual space is a really, really difficult place to encounter differences that matter and that actually cause difference between people and navigate through those and learn from them. And I really think that's how we build a more just world, right? Like we need to deal with difference. Part of why we have white supremacy is because a lot of white people are not great at dealing with the realities of difference or being uncomfortable or moving through that. And so I think that kind of really accountable small community is actually a force for change.
You know, it's interesting you say that because as a trial lawyer, we've seen the court shut down. They haven't reopened. We haven't figured out how to resolve conflict yet.
Right.
We've started moving into that space, and creatively, we saw the first trial put on the other day through Zoom, which was a speeding ticket that took 12 hours to pick a jury.
Wow.
That's an exaggeration, but it was very lengthy.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think that is a really creative thing coming out of this, right? Is learning how to resolve these things in a new medium. And we're seeing great results with mediations through Zoom. And it's really interesting to see how much of the chaff and grain we can cut out.
Yeah.
From a typical, we're having conflict sort of situation.
Right.
But it's new. It is new, like you're saying. You know, I do want to talk about too, just the smaller versus the larger community and what those spaces look like, because I really saw that juxtaposition in your film, like with the, I want to say it was an Oklahoma bar,
Alibis, yeah.
And so, you know, it had a larger space and a larger footprint like you would expect in a place where you can afford a bigger rent versus say the Lex in San Francisco where it was a small footprint but just mass appeal. But what I found interesting too was how people in smaller communities view community and the space and how protective they become over it, because the language the bar owners were using was really, I think, I want to quote her and I'm going to misquote her, but one of the bar owners was saying that unlike any other bar I'd been to, this one was unique because it had a homeliness to it.
Right.
And no matter where I've been in the world, I felt like every queer space, gay bar, leather bar, you name it.
Yeah.
Everybody went there seeking that Cheers familiarity, right? And so I just thought, wow, that really is a way we view ourselves in small communities versus larger communities. And how they also will be meeting up in the virtual world versus a live community space is going. I started thinking about depression and folks that are, you know,
Mm-hmm.
and like that. And I didn't know if you wanted to speak about that at all. And I don't know if I'm picking up any essence of what you wanted to convey in that,
Well,
but
I mean, I think it raises this really important thing, right? Like the first space in the film had to be a bar because it is it is the mythology, it is the mythic place, right?
iconic. Yeah,
It is
yeah.
iconic, and also I think there's in the contemporary world, it is a little bit mythic because there is this promise because we read history and we're told, and even the straight world is like, oh, you're gay, you go to the bars, right? Like if the straight world is asked to like wonder where queer people go, they're going to tell us that we go to bars. um, so we, especially, I know that I experienced, let's just get personal, right? Like I was like, oh, I have to go to a bar, like I'm newly gay, I got to go to a bar. And in major cities, and the cities that get talked about the most when we talk about queer culture, which is a shame, but it's true, right? It's New York, it's San Francisco, it's LA. Those cities eat up an enormous amount of the conversation space. And in those cities, the way queer bars operate is so different than in a place like Oklahoma City. And the reason I ended up in Oklahoma City is because at the time I was filming, there was not a single lesbian or women-centered gay bar or queer bar anywhere in London, England, right? One of the major capitals of the world, not one. But Oklahoma City had two and a half. There's a story there I'll tell another time, but it had at least two.
Well, you mentioned it because you came from London, from the um,
I went to grad school in London. Yeah,
so that juxtaposition actually makes sense to me, knowing that from your.
totally. Yeah. But yeah, so you have this like immediately as like a filmmaker, anybody asking questions like, well, what's going on there, right? Like, and so for me, the question that comes up in that space, and it's even something that we as the crew experiencing, visiting that space, having come from New York, recognizes, yeah, the way that bar functions is totally different than the way that a bar functions in New York City. It is the place, and it is one of the only places. Oklahoma City actually has a number of bars with a primarily male clientele, gay bars. You know, I don't remember the number offhand. I'd have to go back and see what it is today, but it's more than three, right? Or it's like three or four. It's a few. It was certainly more than the number of lesbian or women-focused spaces. And so, where was I going with that? Wait, I lost my thought. I think it's if you only have one space, right? And there's not a lot of, you know, they make it in the, I'm just reiterating what the bar owners say in the film, but essentially like when you only have one space to go, when you're not being accepted, when you know, are encountering challenges in your social world and if you're a religious person in your religious world and your family, then it really is a safe space. It is that thing that we hear about in the past in some of the stories about the bars. It still functions that way. And so I wanted, I guess, to wrap that thought up, I guess I wanted to add that story because again, when we think about the LGBT community, we tend to generalize, and it's just not. Every city is different, the particular politics, the particular communities that are coming together in a space, and we just can't generalize. You know, we have to think specifically.
What was really interesting, now that I think about it too, in that bar in particular, was the bikers, right? So,
Mm-hmm.
so we have just this like rando group of folks who have lobbed onto this community, found acceptance, we're the outliers, I guess, you know, and that's the nice thing about
Well,
our community. We've always been like, yeah, we'll take you.
yeah. Well, it also raises questions too about, so that bar has been a bar for, she couldn't even, nobody knew how long. It's been a bar for at least 70 years. It's been a bar long enough that in Oklahoma, you brought your own bottle and you were paying the bartender to serve you. And it was a biker bar originally. And then the previous owner took it over, and she was a dyke, and it was a lesbian bar for I think about 20 years. And then the owners that you meet in the film took it over in 2013. But I never thought that would be what I would encounter. And the fact that they've merged and found this way to have two spaces in the same space. But again, it also gets to these questions that we don't talk about a lot about when we talk about queer spaces. There's questions about the class of the different folks who are part of it. I mean, that's a mixed space, but it's also like, why do those two communities feel comfortable in the same space together? You know, I don't.
Or do they? And how much code switching is going on?
Yeah.
In order to accommodate
these two communities.
Always is that element of the people that come in, ask the intrusive questions, and for whatever reasons, we go right to it, and we're like, here, you came into our space, we will spend this emotional labor on you.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that I found really interesting that was happening, and I didn't hear a conversation about it, and I thought, there's a lot going on in this space.
It's an amazing space, but I think, again, it just speaks to like extremely the cultural specificity of place and how much geography actually plays a role in shifting the particulars of what queerness looks like in different places.
I was glad to see that complexity in it. And, you know, because I'm here in Texas and because Sharon Bridgeforth is one of my idols, I mentioned that to you before we got onto this.
Yeah.
I throw out the Esperanza Peace and Justice Center in San Antonio.
Yes.
How people like Sharon Bridgeforth really did make just such a huge impact on our artistic community, our activist community, and her writings and works, her jazz-centric theater still current. And
yes,
all her books. I was just reading, I told you a story to my daughter the other day. But I also think about, in the context of what we were just discussing too, you know, it wasn't so long ago, maybe 20 years ago and probably a little longer, where the University of Texas here was bringing students on buses in sex ed classes to the gay bars to basically pet and watch the gays. And it was a regular thing. It was a bar.
That's disgusting.
It was, but it happened every Friday night. This group of folks would come in one every night. It was one semester. It was one group of folks. They would come into the bar. They would stand around and stare at everybody. It was like, here are the gays.
Oh my God.
The interesting thing, right?
Okay.
Even in San Francisco on Castro Street to this day, there are two.
Oh no, there's tourism. Yeah. Look at the gays in leather. Yeah.
Exactly. And then in our community space for Pride, people will be shocked.
Right.
We have a cage everybody goes into outside Fiesta Gardens. They cage in the gays, sell them tickets to go to their own Pride. And that's a community space. But that speaks to Texas and our, it's just a cultural thing that they've accepted.
Okay.
I'm part of this. Yeah. You know?
Well, it's interesting thinking about, just jump in for a hot second to think about like the emotional labor of the people in the bar being gawked at by those students, and like, what is the conversation that's happening between, if any, the actual patrons of the bar versus these like, wow, that's wild to think about.
I was part of that, and we would show off. We would be as camped up,
as gay as possible.
Yeah. And it was labor.
Yeah.
But we made it. That is our resiliency, right?
Right. Right. To sort of thumb your.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, looking at what seems to be, you know, with the pandemic and virtual space on steroids now, do you envision this having an effect on what spaces reopen? And we're getting the tie it up warning, so I think we're
okay, we have a couple minutes.
We have 1 minute.
Yeah, well, I'll just say that, again, going back to the definition, like shared projects and shared goals, I think those won't go away, to be honest. Honestly, I think the real estate landscape is going to change after this it doesn't mean inequality is going to go away. It doesn't mean predatory lending and all the horrors that led us to the economic disaster we're in now aren't going to be there. But I think that, let's just say I'm hopeful that there might be some opportunities I think collectives of different organizations working together and creating space together where it's not necessarily a single entity holding the space, but basically models moving towards ownership in a new way. I know that seems crazy to talk about, but I actually think, you know, you see this in a lot of communities right now, really pushing for ownership. And I even think of things like the Indigenous rights movement and thinking about, you know, taking like demanding the treaty rights are honored and holding land. Like for marginalized communities to hold space is actually hugely powerful. And I'm hopeful that we're going to see an increased attention to that actually coming out of the pandemic.
Let's hope so. Hey, Alexis, it's been a great pleasure.
It has been on my side too. Yeah.
Yeah. I look forward to seeing more from you. Do you have anything planned?
I said I would never make another film again, and I'm already working on another one.
Good for you. I can't wait to see it. So keep us posted, okay?
Well, definitely. Thank you all.
Okay. Thanks for joining us, everybody. And we'll see you on our next Q&A.